Bloomberg just dropped a line that is shaking Washington to its core. Not a rumor, not a leak. A direct, calculated public statement from one of the most powerful financial and geopolitical media institutions on the planet. And the message was stunning. Canada, America's closest neighbor, its oldest ally, the country that shares the longest undefended border in human history, is now being described as Europe's unofficial 28th state. Not America's partner, not Washington's quiet northern friend, Europe's. Let that land for a second. Because while Donald Trump was busy cracking jokes about making Canada the 51st state of America, something nobody in Washington predicted may have already happened behind the scenes. Canada may have already chosen a different direction, and tonight we are going to break down exactly what Bloomberg said, why it sent political insiders into absolute panic, and why this single statement may signal the beginning of the most dramatic geopolitical realignment North America has ever seen. Because this is not just a headline, this is history moving in real time. Here is what nobody is saying loudly enough. Bloomberg does not use language carelessly. This is not a tabloid. This is not a political opinion blog. Bloomberg is the financial and geopolitical Bible of presidents, prime ministers, central bankers, and the most powerful investment institutions on earth. When Bloomberg frames a country in a specific way, markets move, governments respond, strategies shift. So when Bloomberg publicly describes Canada as behaving like Europe's unofficial 28th member state, that is not a throwaway line. That is a signal. A deliberate, carefully chosen signal. And the question everyone in Washington is now asking behind closed doors is brutally simple. How did we get here? How did the United States, the most powerful country in the history of civilization, somehow push its closest ally so far that the world's most respected financial outlet is now publicly comparing Canada to a European nation rather than an American partner? The answer to that question is uncomfortable. And it starts with a man who never does anything quietly. Donald Trump came back into power with a familiar playbook. Pressure your partners, test your allies, turn relationships into transactions. And for most of the world, that approach created tension. But for Canada, it created something more dangerous than tension. It created a question that once asked cannot be unasked. What if America is no longer a reliable partner? Now understand how radical that question is in the Canadian context. For generations, the relationship between Canada and the United States was considered untouchable. Not perfect, never perfect, but permanent. The two countries shared everything: defense systems, intelligence networks, supply chains, energy infrastructure, cultural identity, family connections across the border. The assumption was baked into everything. Canada needs America. America protects Canada. The geography made it feel inevitable. But geography only feels inevitable until politics breaks the spell. And Donald Trump, whether intentionally or not, may have broken the spell in ways that cannot easily be repaired. Think about what Canada experienced over recent years. Tariff threats on steel. Tariff threats on aluminum. Tariff threats on cars. Pressure on dairy. Aggressive renegotiation of trade deals that Canada thought were settled. And then, cutting through all of it like a blade, the repeated suggestion that Canada should simply become America's 51st state. Now Trump's supporters will say it was always a joke, a negotiating tactic, a pressure move designed to remind Canada who holds the power. But here is the problem with using that kind of language repeatedly. At some point, the other side, stops laughing. At some point, leaders start doing the math. At some point, someone in Ottawa sits down in a quiet room and asks the question that changes everything. What would Canada look like if it was never this vulnerable to American political mood swings again? That question, that single uncomfortable question, may be the most important thing driving every move Canada has made since. And the man credited with turning that question into a strategy has a name: Mark Carney. Now, whether you support Carney politically or not, something about his background demands attention. This is not a career politician who learned power through campaign rallies and party fundraisers. This is a man who ran the Bank of Canada, who then ran the Bank of England, who navigated some of the most complex financial crises the modern world has seen, who spent decades thinking not about next month or next election, but about decade-long risk, structural vulnerability, and long-term stability. When a man like that looks at Canada's relationship with Washington and sees fragility, he does not write a strongly worded speech. He builds an alternative architecture, quietly, methodically, patiently. And some political observers now believe that is precisely what the world is watching unfold in real time. Because look at the pattern of moves coming out of Ottawa and the picture starts becoming impossible to ignore. Deeper engagement with European capitals, more frequent security conversations with NATO partners outside of American frameworks, growing economic cooperation with Germany, France, and Brussels, trade diversification conversations that would have seemed unnecessary 5 years ago, language from Canadian officials that sounds less North American and increasingly more aligned with European strategic thinking. None of these moves alone looks revolutionary. That is the whole point. Because the most powerful geopolitical shifts in history never announce themselves. They accumulate. They build quietly. One agreement at a time, one relationship at a time, one handshake at a time. Until one morning the world wakes up and Bloomberg is describing Canada not as Washington's partner, but as Europe's 28th state. And suddenly, everyone realizes the shift already happened while they were looking somewhere else. Here's the part that makes this story even more explosive. Europe was not a passive actor in all of this. Europe was not simply sitting back waiting to see what Canada would do. Europe was actively looking for exactly what Canada had to offer. And the timing could not have been more perfect. Because Europe in recent years has been going through its own crisis of confidence about American reliability. Questions about NATO commitments. Questions about American political stability. Questions about whether Washington would remain a dependable security and economic partner through the turbulence of its own internal divisions. European leaders began asking something that once felt unthinkable. What if we cannot count on America the way we used to? And the moment Europe started seriously asking that question, Canada started looking like something extraordinary. Not a distant North American country, not a junior partner of Washington, but a natural democratic ally, a country with massive energy reserves, critical minerals, advanced institutions, shared values, and now very visible frustration with the same unpredictability that was making Europe nervous about Washington. Canada and Europe were suddenly looking at each other and seeing something familiar, seeing something useful, seeing something that felt, for the first time in a long time, like genuine strategic alignment. And the resources Canada brings to this emerging relationship cannot be overstated. Because this is not just about diplomatic language and shared democratic values. This is about hard, physical, strategic power. Canada sits on some of the largest reserves of critical minerals on Earth: lithium, nickel, uranium, cobalt. The raw materials that the entire future of technology, clean energy, and defense manufacturing depends on. Europe is desperate for exactly these resources. Europe has spent years trying to reduce its dependence on unstable or adversarial suppliers for the minerals it needs to build the next generation of everything from electric vehicles to weapons systems to advanced semiconductors. And then Canada arrives, a stable democracy, a trusted partner, sitting on a geological treasure chest that Europe needs more urgently with every passing year. Suddenly the relationship stops being symbolic and starts being structural. And structural relationships are the ones that last, the ones that survive political changes, the ones that reshape the world quietly but permanently. So here is where we stand. Bloomberg has put a name to something that was already moving beneath the surface. Canada drifting, not loudly, not dramatically, but unmistakably toward a new center of strategic gravity. And Washington, for all its power, for all its leverage, for all its assumptions about Canadian loyalty, may be watching something it never believed was possible. Its closest ally quietly building a future that no longer places America at the absolute center. But here is the question that should be keeping everyone in Washington awake at night. If Canada, the country America assumed would never ever seriously look elsewhere, is already moving, what does that tell every other American ally watching this story unfold right now? Here is what makes this story different from every other geopolitical headline you have seen this year. Most political shifts take decades to become visible. Most alliance changes happen so slowly that historians only recognize them long after the damage is done. But what is happening between Canada and Europe right now is moving at a speed that is making seasoned diplomats genuinely uncomfortable. Because the groundwork that normally takes a generation to build is being compressed into years, maybe months. And the reason for that acceleration has everything to do with one thing: Washington refuses to honestly examine the cost of taking your closest allies for granted. Because let us be very clear about something. Canada did not wake up one morning and decide to become anti-American. That framing is wrong, and it is dangerous because it misses the entire point of what is actually happening. Canada is not running away from America. Canada is running toward stability. And that distinction matters enormously because it tells you everything about what kind of shift this really is. This is not emotional. This is not ideological. This is strategic. This is a country doing the cold, rational calculation that any serious nation must eventually do when its primary relationship becomes a source of unpredictability rather than security. And when you understand it that way, suddenly every move Canada has made starts looking less like a diplomatic accident and more like a carefully engineered escape from vulnerability. Think about what vulnerability actually means at the national level. For decades, roughly 3/4 of Canadian exports flowed directly into the American market. 3/4. That is not a trade relationship. That is a dependency. And dependencies are not partnerships. Dependencies are pressure points. Because when one country controls where another country sends the overwhelming majority of its economic output, that first country holds leverage that goes far beyond any single negotiation or any single tariff dispute. It holds the ability to threaten the entire economic foundation of the dependent nation simply by changing its political mood. And for Canada, watching American politics become increasingly volatile, increasingly unpredictable, increasingly willing to use economic relationships as weapons rather than partnerships, that vulnerability stopped feeling manageable. It started feeling dangerous. And dangerous vulnerabilities demand strategic responses, not speeches, not complaints, responses. So what does a strategic response actually look like when you are Canada? It does not look like a dramatic announcement. It does not look like a press conference where the Prime Minister stands up and declares that Canada is breaking with Washington. That would be political theater, and Mark Carney is not interested in theater. What it looks like is quieter and far more consequential. It looks like Canadian trade officials suddenly appearing in Berlin and Paris with detailed proposals for long-term mineral supply agreements. It looks like Canadian defense planners engaging with European NATO partners on frameworks that do not automatically route through American command structures. It looks like Canadian energy executives sitting across tables from their counterparts in Brussels discussing infrastructure investments that would send Canadian liquefied natural gas across the Atlantic rather than exclusively south through American pipelines. None of these things make front-page news on their own, but together they represent something Washington should be paying very serious attention to: the systematic reduction of Canadian economic exposure to American political risk. One agreement at a time, one relationship at a time, one pipeline, one mineral contract, one defense framework at a time. And here is the part of this story that truly does not get enough attention. Europe is not simply accepting Canada as a new partner. Europe is actively competing for Canada, because the European Union, for all its internal complications and political tensions, understands something about strategic assets. When a country with Canada's combination of resources, stability, democratic institutions, and now clear motivation to diversify away from its traditional anchor relationship becomes available, you move quickly. You do not wait. You do not send a polite diplomatic note and hope for the best. You show up. You offer deals. You make the relationship so structurally attractive that reversing it becomes harder and harder with every passing month. And that is exactly what European leaders appear to be doing right now. The speed of European diplomatic engagement with Ottawa has reportedly surprised even some Canadian officials, because Europe smells an opportunity that comes along perhaps once in a generation. A wealthy, stable, resource-rich North American democracy that is actively looking for a reason to deepen ties beyond its traditional relationship with Washington. That opportunity does not come twice, and Europe knows it. Now zoom out for a moment and look at what this means for the global picture, because this is where the implications become truly staggering. For the entire post-World War II era, the Western Alliance was built around a specific architecture: America at the center, Europe as the primary partner, Canada as the reliable, predictable, always aligned northern neighbor of the American anchor. That architecture shaped everything: diplomacy, defense, trade, intelligence sharing, technology development, financial systems. The assumption that Canada sat firmly in the American orbit was so fundamental that it barely needed to be stated. It was simply understood by everyone, including Canada. But what Bloomberg's framing suggests, what the pattern of moves coming out of Ottawa suggests, what the accelerating pace of Canada-Europe engagement suggests, is that this architecture may be quietly but genuinely shifting. And when the architecture shifts, everything built on top of it has to shift too. Consider the defense implications alone, because they are profound. Canada is a NATO member. Canada has deep, integrated defense relationships with the United States through agreements like NORAD that go back generations. American and Canadian military systems are woven together in ways that most people never think about because they have always simply worked. But NATO is also a European alliance, and as Canada deepens its engagement with European NATO partners, as Canadian defense conversations increasingly happen in Brussels and not just in Washington, the center of gravity of Canadian strategic thinking begins to move. Not overnight, not completely, but enough. Enough that Washington can no longer assume automatic alignment on every major security question. Enough that Canada begins developing independent relationships with European defense partners that give Ottawa options it simply did not have before. And options, in geopolitics, are everything. Because a country with options negotiates differently than a country without them. A country with options cannot be pressured the same way. A country with options can afford to say no, and a Canada that can afford to say no to Washington is a fundamentally different Canada than the one America thought it knew. But here is where the story takes its most dramatic turn yet. Because some analysts now believe that Donald Trump, in his determination to pressure Canada into submission, may have made a strategic miscalculation of historic proportions. The logic of Trump's approach toward Canada was always built on a simple assumption. Canada has nowhere else to go. Geography locks Canada into dependence on America. No matter how much Ottawa complains, no matter how much Canadian politicians talk tough for domestic audiences, at the end of the day, Canada needs the American market more than America needs Canada. Therefore, pressure works, tariffs work. Even the 51st state rhetoric works as a reminder of the power imbalance. But that entire logic collapses the moment Canada genuinely starts building alternatives. Because the assumption was never really about geography, it was about options. And if Mark Carney is successfully creating options for Canada, then the foundation of Trump's leverage begins to erode. Slowly at first, then faster, until one day, Washington looks north and realizes that the pressure tactics that used to produce results are producing something very different now. Not compliance. Acceleration. Every threat accelerating Canada's push for independence. Every tariff accelerating European trade diversification. Every 51st state joke accelerating the political will inside Canada to make sure that joke never becomes anything more than a joke. And the world is watching every single move. Because if Canada, America's most integrated, most culturally connected, most geographically locked ally, can successfully reduce its dependence on Washington, then the message to every other American ally on the planet is deafening. Nobody is too close to diversify. Nobody is too dependent to find alternatives. Nobody is too locked in to eventually walk toward a different center of gravity if pushed hard enough and long enough. That message, spreading quietly through diplomatic circles in Tokyo, Seoul, Canberra, Warsaw, and beyond, may ultimately prove to be the most consequential consequence of everything unfolding right now, not the Canada-Europe relationship itself, but what it tells the rest of the world about the permanent nature of American alliances. And folks, here is the question that should stop every single person watching this in their tracks. If the country that shares the longest undefended border in history with America, the country that has been Washington's most loyal partner for over a century, the country that was supposed to be the one ally that would never, under any circumstances, seriously look elsewhere, if that country is already moving already building, already diversifying, already being described by Bloomberg as Europe's 28th state. Then what exactly does America still have that it thinks makes its alliances permanent? Because history has a brutal answer to that question, and it is coming faster than Washington is ready for.